I know that some people don't like the phrase natural set because there's this massive tendency to think about everything as some kind of ossified orthodoxy. Everything's been named and put in a box and passed down like property from the past. Let's say instead natural movements of the body, simple natural movements of the body. Those added up together equate to what we might call, for the sake of expediency, the natural set. Out of all of those movements, the simplest are simple movements of the leg, simple movements of the feet, like half foot release force. And even though they're the simplest movements, they are in many ways the most difficult to do. They require the most finesse. And we'll see why that is shortly. But for now, we can say that people tend to overlook these movements because the reason that we use them most of all is to set other postures. So they're usually unnoticed as we're looking at other things, like, for example, someone doing elbow strikes. We don't usually look at the feet. But this is just the principle of postures being structurally sympathetic with other postures. Those movements of the feet are all release force postures in their own right. They just interlink with other postures seamlessly. And in each one we call that structural sympathy, but in principle it's the same idea that they developed in the Qin dynasty, where they made all of their military materiel to a standard gauge, and that allowed everything to be, well, easily used, easily replaced, easily mended. You could always find a spare part, but it also made the whole military force interlinked together in a way that other military forces didn't. Obviously that's not a deliberate thing in each one because it's just based on nature. It's just the way that nature functions. It's almost like each one is a mathematical system and it all interlinks together in that way. But it's interesting to think about that parallel, not least because it's the absolute foundation of this idea that in a crisis you won't be able to think about too many complex things. You've got to be able to intuitively just use these postures. So if they all interlink together with structural sympathy, that will flow just naturally at a certain point of cultivation. In any case, practicing these postures on their own, these release force postures from the feet, and understanding how they function will massively transform your overall Yiquan skill. Once you practice them on their own and start to improve them, then you'll find that your ability to use other postures will significantly increase. So it's well worth having a good close look at these. And as we're talking about intuition and release force, remember that a couple of videos I emphasised this idea that people tend to confuse what they're used to with what's intuitive. So given a particular task or a particular problematic to think about, if it's, well, whether it's on the spot or whether you actually stop and think about it, most people will come to a solution that is the one that they're most used to doing. And if you do it on the fly, like if you're sparring or something like that, it's very easy to confuse a movement that's just habitual, that's just what you're used to doing, with something that's intuitive. And in a way it is intuitive because you will intuitively do what you've trained to do. And this is why Wang Shengzai emphasizes that you've got to bring these things up into consciousness and make them trained reflexes. They're not just innate, like the fundamental things that we're working on are innate. The ability to use our physical bodies is just there by definition of how the physical body is structured. But the ability to use actual martial arts postures, that's not innate. You're not born with it. You've got to bring it up into consciousness and make it into a conscious reflex. And for various negative reasons that I don't really want to re-emphasize, there's a problem in each one where people hold on to particular kinds of ideological perspectives, one of which is this thing about assuming that anything that you just do in the moment is intuitive. And that's a very problematic idea because it fails to understand that you can train in bad habits just as much as you can train in good habits. And just because you're doing a bad habit without thinking about it, or making the wrong decision without really thinking about it, that isn't intuitive in the way that we mean intuitively do the right thing. And one very useful and apposite here example is the double front push forwards with the scrape rooting, which is a very famous posture in Yiquan. I don't know why it has this immense status. It takes on this, I don't know what it is. It's a really difficult posture to make use in practice. It's a very difficult posture to make use under pressure. It's incredibly difficult to get both your hands on someone's chest and push them. Although you can do it against the guard, then it becomes even more problematic. Nevertheless, it's a very famous posture, and it uses this idea of a car suddenly braking, which is how we initially try and get the idea across of how to set postures, and the critical concept of hit and stop, which, as we've looked at before, Wang Xiangjai says explicitly, this is the absolute core concept that defines Yiquan, the ability to use kinetic force and then suddenly stop and transmit that force, what in modern terms we call hit and stop. Hit and stop, that's my accent again. And although we're not looking at pushers quite yet in this series, I want to look at this particular posture so that we can contrast it with a different solution to the problematic of releasing force with the lead leg. And I want to start by pointing out that it's quite an odd looking posture, and this is a slightly unorthodox version because I'm pushing out with my hands with the fingers facing each other. I wouldn't always normally do that. I usually don't do that when I'm practicing it on a bag. And this that I'm doing on the bag here is a slightly different version anyway, because we'll look at later that there's a hybrid posture between gap and brace Farley, which is much more useful for pushing. And I very often practice that on the bag. The problem with this posture, which I should say also, by the way, that this is the kind of posture you'll see a lot of fights started with, even if it's not that easy to get it in sparring. You will see fights start like this. In which case I still think it's more important to be able to counter it than to be able to do it. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. The thing with turning the hands inwards a little bit, which is what I usually do, is it's the standard Chen Tai Chi Chuan counter to being double pushed, to just lean forward so that it pushes the opponent's fingers back against their own wrists. So I'm always kind of wary of that, and I always want to just turn my hands in a little bit for the push. Point being, that does actually counter that. It gives you a little bit more flexibility around the wrist area. Well, obviously it doesn't, but it makes it harder to push your fingers back from that position. But then on top of that, we can see that it's a quite odd posture compared to all our other sorts of Yiquan postures. It's kind of hunched forwards. The body's making this arc as it leans forward, and there's something about it that just looks odd, the way that the legs are working with the posture. But it is absolutely in accordance with the laws and principles of Yiquan, and it's also the correct solution to how to issue kinetic force forwards in a double palm push. It's entirely in harmony with the laws of physics and the realities of physiology. But the main reason that it looks so odd is that if you are used to doing a lot of stand-up, then the most significant contexts in your world are open and close. And that's not the same, for example, if you do a lot of wrestling type stuff where rise and sink play a much more important role. And again, this is about confusing intuition with what you're used to. So if open and close play the most dominant role in your use of contexts, then when you see something that has rise or sink as a dominant context, then it will look odd, it will look out of place, as if it's not according to the rules. This posture uses, by my calculation, the way we've been looking at it, it uses something like 30% close and 70% sink, although that's a little bit misleading. Just depends how we calculate that. We don't want to overcomplicate that. But just in your normal stance, your leg is quite far into the closed posture anyway. And it's not just about the angle of your leg, it's about heuristically how you feel how much of each context is going into the posture. So it feels to me about 30% of it is close and then the other 70% of it is sink, but it's a very unusual kind of sink. And basically anyway, from close, the body moves forward, the torso moves forward, so you remain in that use of close, and from there the rear hand is dominant. In this version, the rear hand is dominant, just as in an orthodox use of close like a cross. But from there, we're doing something a little bit unusual with the set of the posture. So we're using scrape rooting on the lead foot. And from this very nice still, we can see the leg posture quite clearly. It's very similar. Well, it's the same thing really. It's the subduing the tiger standing pole stance that most people in Yiquan are used to. And we can see that as the leg goes out to its furthest point, that incorporates this principle that close contains open and open contains close, because it starts to stretch the legs, it starts to stretch that close to its limit. But what I really want you to notice is the position of the lead foot. And from previous videos, we're already fully up to speed with the idea of the ball of the foot hitting first and then the heel hitting in. And that's where the posture stabilizes, and it's where it locks into position because that's the set of the posture. There are a few things that we need to understand about that, but one at a time. So the first thing we're thinking about is how we are incorporating sync into this posture. So look at how the torso is over the lead leg, look at how the quad is tipped and the rear leg's dropped, so everything's dropped down, but there's something more interesting going on here. This is a compression set. It's using sync to make the consistency of the structure more solid at the point of impact. So let's try doing the same posture but without leaning the body forward, just doing the movement with the foot. And absolutely try this yourself because you really need to feel it to understand it, but you can feel that there's not all that much weight going down onto the heel, and remember it's the heel hitting the floor where the posture is going to set. So from there you start experimenting and you start thinking, well, what if I lean my body forwards a little bit more, get more weight over my heel? In fact, it's not just about getting weight over your heel. You can amplify the strength that you can transmit, i.e. you can make your consistency much more solid at the impact point by doing a more explosive movement with your upper body from the quad. So as if you're hitting down with your chest, and that's the use of sync. And because it's right over your leg, it pushes the heel down into the floor much more explosively. It creates this, what Wang Xiangjai calls the rebound effect. In other words, it's a compression set, which so far we've only seen on the rear leg. This is on the lead leg. And of course all of these things are structurally sympathetic with one another. The release force forwards and down helps to aid the Farley into the push, aid the strength, but at the same time it also pushes down and creates this compression set. And that in turn enhances the consistency of the structure. So for the same amount of kinetic force generation, we can transmit more of it more efficiently to the target if our consistency is more dense, and that's what this does. And there is another principle that I've mentioned that we'll look at another time in more detail, which Wang Xiangjai talks about, which is when you hit the other person, the energy of that hit also compresses your structure and increases the kind of consistency that we want, a denser consistency. But we don't need to go into that here. It's just one of those postures where if you do it against a light target, it doesn't look that powerful. Then the heavier the target you do it against, the more powerful it looks because it amplifies this consistency effect. So an idea that Wang Xiangjai talks about, but we'll come back to it. It's nothing magical, it's just the laws of physics in action. And along with that, remember this principle that the ball of the foot hits and then the heel cracks down like it's cracking down on a nut. We've got to get all of that timed into one movement. And from there, take notice of just how far the foot moves. It's not a great deal. Look, it starts here and then it moves to here. So it's a very small movement. And remember that Wang Xiangjai says that in Yiquan, everything that's important happens within the space of an inch. And I've mentioned before, and it's a good time to go back to this idea as we can see it really clearly here, that this doesn't mean that Yiquan is a close range art or something like that. It means that Yiquan, i.e. the use of Farley, occurs within the space of a Chinese inch, which I've mentioned before is about 3 inches in imperial inches. And that is pretty much exactly the amount of distance I'm covering with this posture. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it's within the laws of physics itself that within that space of approximately a Chinese inch, you can reach maximum velocity for Farley. So if our force generation is mass times velocity, then that's the space that we need to do it in. And I know that very often people find it difficult to get their minds around this, but you can't get a faster Farley by having a bigger run-up with it. So doing it over 3 Chinese inches will just get the same amount of speed as doing it over 1 Chinese inch. There are only a very limited number of things you can do to amplify that force. So one, you can use compensatory force, so you can get more mass into the posture by stepping in with it or moving fast forwards. Or, because you want to do both, you can change the consistency of your posture so that you can transmit more of the kinetic force that you generate in the first place. So you make the posture more efficient. But the essential engine, the Farley itself, happens within the space of a Chinese inch approximately. And that's entirely determined by the laws of physics. And I know it's a commonly held misconception that what we're talking about is short-range martial arts, short-range techniques, whatever that is supposed to mean. because it's not always entirely clear what that means if you use steps and so on. But nevertheless, look at this video of me doing double push into front kick, and you can see that one of the postures is very short, i.e. the double push. The other posture is very long, i.e. the front kick. But you can also see clearly that the far lead for both is pretty much identical, and it happens within the space of a Chinese inch pretty much in both cases, regardless of the size of the actual posture. And I know that some people have got this wrong, and I know that some people are embarrassed about getting it wrong because they are Yiquan teachers. But as I always say, I'm always prepared to help everyone try and get this right. In any case, if you try and then extend this posture, make the leg go out further, doing it in this way, then you start to have some problems. All the elements that make it work are finely balanced to fit within that Chinese inch, and if you start extending it, the posture itself becomes imbalanced, but that's not our biggest problem here. The biggest problem is that the farley has already occurred, and then the posture extends forwards, so the moment of power generation and transmission has gone. It's not the same as those kicks where the farley just happens at the end point. Here, the farley is happening at the beginning point, and then the posture is extending out. Think about this. Try it yourself. Physically problem solve it with the concepts that we've been learning up to this point. Obviously, the solution is to switch everything round so that the farley is on the end of it. So the leg slides out. That's if our problematic is we want to slide our leg much further out, engage with the opponent's leg, say, and release force. How do we do that? Well, obviously we've got to switch it round so that the farley is on the end. So the leg's going to go out, and then right at the last minute, just like those kicks, then the farley is applied. But if you try and do that with close, what happens? Well, just like before, everything was finely balanced. Now it's grossly imbalanced. The thighs go in line, and that makes the whole structure collapse at the quad. You can try this yourself. It loses all structural strength and integrity, so you couldn't hit against an object and transmit force. But also, equally importantly, there's a separation between the release of force and the set of the posture. And that makes the whole posture completely pointless. So this isn't the way to do it. There has to be a different solution.